Third discourse, subjective thought. Everything is a reduction of a single state of consciousness. This is a fact. This is what, for example, all the quantum physicists and biochemists and the philosophers are attempting to do. Find an ultimate singularity or truth. It should be obvious to anyone in a state of so-called analysis of consciousness to see that a unified force field is the same as God. There would ultimately be no difference in the idea of a unification of apparent objectivity to a singularity that would obviously constitute God. Remember that in this state of consciousness, everything is reduced. Historically, in that sense, Paul reduces Jesus, doesn't he? Augustinian ideas reduce Neoplatonism. Of course, inevitably, Newton, for example, is an offspring of Aristotle, who reduced Plato. Sure, of course. Look right at it. There is finally no difference in the notion of Newtonian logic or Newtonian science than in, say, objective deification. They're all the same. They're the same idea. Do you see that? The idea is that unity can be established outside of you. Obviously, then, the next step beyond that would be for science to establish what? First, the idea of relativity, which is an incredible expose of consciousness. It's fun, historically, to look at how it occurred to Einstein, how it came about. The idea of relativity involved what could be termed a mystical experience. That's a nice thing to look at, and of course it's true, it did. Do you have any idea what the new, young, modern minds in 2 generations since Einstein really are capable of constructing in their own minds? Try to get a hold of this if you can. You go and sit with a group, young group sometime, that's really in states of thinking, and we're talking 60, 70 years here. I'm just going to point out the obvious so-called evolution of consciousness. This occurred with me in a very high nature. I remember very well. I was about 12 years old, maybe younger, and I suddenly was presented with a pop version of the notion of relativity. And I'll never forget the experience that I had when I looked at it. There was a deep intuition in me that caused a flourish of energy in my head, where I was automatically able to conceive of how completely rational the notion of relativity is. The problem that my mind subsequently had with that idea was to sort out the limited definitions that were applied in attempts to communicate to me what relativity was. If you want to see a young mind work today, watch them take, for example, the negativism of Schopenhauer, shake it out in about 2 minutes and come up with the truth of it. Real easy. The young minds are doing that. They may do it in the nature of an expansion of Star Wars or Darth Vader, but they do it in their mind. Can you get it? Do you see what I'm saying to you? They will take a beautiful divine notion of Spinoza and redefine it in a single sentence in A Course in Miracles and take it right up to its truth. Do you see what happens with those minds? They are not reducing themselves to some sort of qualitative analysis of fracturedism. They put together. And that is really what we're trying to bring about in your mind. Do you see that? Can you see what we're trying to do? Finally, the notion of Augustinian philosophy or Newtonian physics is highly regarded in a certain scarcity of limitation. For example, with the Pope, who is a master of phenomenology, which is a high statement that there can be objective phenomena outside the single realization of selfness. The Pope will take it right straight up to the point of refusing to recognize that he is in fact instigating the phenomena. Do you see that? The whole basis of quantum thinking, of A Course in Miracles, of absolute thought without object or subjectivity, is the notion of noumena, or that you are involved in any equation in regard to your thinking. Holy mackerel, how beautiful! We can teach that, but we must teach it through a process of recognition that the occurrence is in fact a form of exposé. All limited consciousness is willing to acknowledge the occurrence of an expansion or realization, generally speaking, as to music, as to art, as to philosophy, as to science, and as to religion. But the inevitable tendency reduces it to a form of duality, simply because the consciousness is not capable of a notion of what you might term non-objective existentialism. There is no truer statement in the universe than cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But once you've arrived at that inevitable conclusion, the question continues to arise. But who am I? Whence comes this notion of my existence? Wow, what an occurrence, yes. Finally it comes more down to the necessity for consciousness to verify itself. All creation finally is unity verification of the extension of a total idea. How do you express that? This is in A Course in Miracles. Everybody finally only creates their own notion of themselves. Don't you see that? It falls into a limited framework of consciousness simply because they have identified themselves as separate from the single unity. Wow, that's more Newtonian than that idea. What is more Newtonian than that idea? And what is more unifying than the idea of quantum, or the idea of a single force of congruity that finally has to arrive at the incredible delineation that the universe is only consciousness? That's a simplistic thing, finally, because truth is extremely simple. It's the notion that truth has moving parts, or is somehow devious, that causes all of your concern. The requirement in coming to know that involved in the actual process is one of non-subtraction of the self in relationship to everything that is apparently outside of it. This is the process that we teach, which is nothing more than what we started out with in a conversation in A Course in Miracles, where we attempt to teach the consciousness to look at what is apparently objective and not establish its reality, but rather ask it what it is. This dissociates you from your own memory patterns in association with duality. That's really what happens. The problem that Brother Albert Einstein had with arriving at the conclusion of the unified force field was only his inability to carry the concept of it to the inclusion of his own idea about it. He ended up with the inevitable apparent notion that God is rolling dice. And this is his expression. He said, I can't believe that God rolls dice. Obviously, if there is such a thing as true objectivity, there's an element of chance that has to be involved. It would be inevitable because there is no basic order in the concept of the apparent reality. Do you see? It causes futurizing automatically. It cannot not. It is that little muddy, that thought. My mind is coming too fast. I can't express it. We may express it to you that it is impossible for you to have an original thought. You are thinking in the past tense, and any projection you do in time-space sequencing must involve your previous connotations of yourself. You construct your future, in other words, based on the past. Obviously, the consciousness you, individually, the universe. Speaking to us now is Brother Andrew, who occasionally may appear to be some sort of antagonist, but in very high sense presents Socratic ideas which are subsequently discussed in unlimited frameworks. Brother Andrew, I have heard of a situation where a person was hypnotized and given a suggestion that at a signal, he would take off his shoe and put it on top of the fireplace mantel. When the signal was given, this occurred. When he was asked why he did it, he made up an excuse to explain the behavior which he didn't even understand himself. He said his foot was warm and he wanted to take his shoe off, and he put it on the mantel because he wanted to make sure he knew where it was. Whatever. We're looking at the idea that he had to justify the action. That's the whole dilemma. Brother Andrew, my question pertains to behavior that you are attributing to us that we may not be consciously responsible. You're not consciously, but ultimately you are responsible for your behavior and do in fact justify it in some regard. This is the whole basis of what I teach, Brother Andrew, but it is unconscious. Who cares? You have forgotten God. What you can call the consciousness is limited to your idea about yourself and subsequently makes you stay within the framework. That's why I teach that it is indeed a transformative occurrence. You listening to what I'm saying. I am trying to change your mindset in this regard. Obviously, every action must be justified or the action would not occur. The whole basis of what we teach is non-motivated action. Listen to me. I want to say this one other way to you. Obviously, the hypnotist was conveying to the other limited state of consciousness first a basic recognition of objectivity. The consciousness hypnotized did not say to the hypnotist, "What is a shoe?" I ask you to ask the hypnotist, "What is a shoe?" Do you see? Well, look at it. Obviously, the hypnotist and the one hypnotized shared a limited concept of the ability to take off a shoe, composed in some sort of relationship of energy that apparently constituted a body. All of it is objective thinking and limited. All that you presented to me was limited. I can take it and move it up into a framework of truth for you. The justification of the necessity to remove the shoe is the justification of self-identity. It will inevitably occur within the state of consciousness. It cannot not. Brother Andrew, how can we do the things that you're asking us to do when we don't even know the reasons why we're doing the things that we're doing? But you have a perfect purpose. You have constructed an idea of unity in your head and express it. Brother Andrew, but I didn't do it consciously. Of course not, because consciously you deny it. You don't appear to, but in a state of limited consciousness, obviously you are denying singularity. That is a fact. Now you may say to me, I choose not to believe I'm denying it. And I'm perfectly willing to go along with the idea that you have not reached a metamorphic position in your so-called transformation, where you have access to a unified form of thinking. All I say to you then is, since you have constructed it in your mind, and you obviously have the capacity to bring it about, I would suggest that you do so. If you are determined to remain within the limited framework of your consciousness, we are now directly involved with what we teach, because the necessity for you to take off your shoe and put on the shoe is precisely why you are here, which is nothing more than a limited self-identification. What I say to you in an attempt to stir you from this is to inform you with the certainty that there literally is nothing outside of you, of your thoughts about it. If you were to look at it in that way, I would say to you, everything that you think there is all that there is, and there is nothing but that. This will cause you deep concern because you are determined that there is a form of discrete thinking that is occurring outside of your framework, which is exactly what Newtonian physics maintains. The quantumist has arrived at the incredible obvious conclusion that there is no discernment between energies, that they're all finally the same thing. The next and only final step that can be made is that they are finally you. It does not matter how you constitute yourself, don't you see that? There's nothing to compare you with. You insist on comparing yourself with things that are apparently outside of you, as Jesus would teach in A Course in Miracles, and as it is taught by Buddha. Who taught it more emphatically than Buddha? Buddha is reduced automatically. Christ reduced to Christianity, of course. Does Plato reduce Aristotle? Of course. It goes on and on and on. Everything is always a reduction, but finally it reduces only to you. Brother Andrew, how does Buddha exist? In any attempt to define him, it's an automatic reduction. The idea of the next step, or the idea of the transformation occurrence which occurred with Jesus Christ in the establishment of the capacity of the consciousness to evolve, which is what Christianity is, and all it is, was automatically reduced and turned out to be a process of death to find life, which has no reality. This is all in A Course in Miracles. In the text it's beautifully expressed. You finally do not die to live. You never die. It's your acknowledgement of the idea of limitation that sustains you in this state. You are in a state of absolute objection to the idea of eternity because it involves time for you, and it cannot involve time. If I say to you that you're going to sit there forever and ever, you refute me by standing up and walking and sitting in another chair. You understood me. Good. I see the way your mind is working. Your mind is working, obviously, only in the past tense. Everything that's constructed in you is based on what apparently has already occurred. If you do that, if you really look at that, you are not really thinking about now. You're only thinking about a moment ago. Obviously, you can't think about next week or next month. What is expressed in A Course in Miracles is that the mind of everyone on earth is actually blank. Look at it. So we attempt to bring you into the now, which is really what eternity is. Watch a human being come together in a group with an establishment in limitation and attempt to communicate. They will succeed only on a very limited level, but that is really all they ask for. They will say, I don't require that you understand me totally, but it would be certainly nice if we would not nuke each other, that we would not kill each other, or that we could get together and have a little relationship here, or that we could certainly share a lot of common things until we have our demise, until we die. So in reality, there's absolutely no communication occurring here, except when it is transcendent. One of the highest forms of communication is if you go to the Chicago Symphony tonight and 1,000 people sit in the auditorium and share an impulse of energy, a conglomeration of rhythms and patterns of sound, of the notations of the chromatic scale, they will enter into a form of symbiosis of a very high nature. That is what communication is. Communication ultimately has nothing to do with the definition of it. If there is one thing that Jesus teaches in A Course in Miracles, it is that experience can be unified, or that God is experiential. That is the whole basis of the Course, and can be shared because we have an absolute common denominator of reality. So let's take it a step further. It would be very nice if I could show you, say I go like this, psst, blah. It was absolutely no significance at all. Somewhere along the line you were determined in your mind at that moment to give me a cause and effect relationship in regard to what you considered me to be. It's absolutely inevitable. The basis of Zen, or a koan, I believe you call it, is to bring about a shift in your consciousness where you no longer are sequential in your thinking. Do you see that? And you go, wow, what's he trying to do? Why are you doing that? Don't tell me you don't have a reason for doing that. You're manipulating me. At the very most, you try to wake me up. Brother Andrew, your analogy to people sitting in the symphony and sharing transcendental consciousness is very apropos, but as soon as you go to open your mouth and talk about it, you've entered into the rabble, attempting to solve the problem at the level of the problem, and it can never be done that way. Sure, I know, agreed. Therefore, you're condemned to hell forever. Brother Andrew, no. Well, okay, then as soon as you say no, then you allow for my insinuation of energy into you in the sharing. Brother Andrew, I allowed that, but as soon as you open your mouth, you're out of it. Yeah, but I can't extend without energy. I can't extend without an idea. Brother Andrew, that's how you generate your Shakti. Sure, of course, that's the highest form you can do. That's what God does. You're right on the mark. God generates Shakti by extension of a true idea. If you want to look at it that way, certainly. But remember, only you can do it. The tendency is to think that somehow Jesus calls it in A Course in Miracles an absolute relationship of brotherhood that is inevitable in consciousness. The idea of establishment in time implies that there can be one consciousness that has arrived at a particular point within the framework that seems to be more advanced. I am absolutely totally aware in my awakening that there are no degrees in consciousness, that there genuinely are not hierarchies of consciousness. The idea of hierarchy or establishment of planes of consciousness always occurs in the limited state as it attempts to identify singularity. And in that process, it has a validity because there's obviously an application of the possibility of a revolution or an evolvement to a higher state, which is contained in the basic necessity to overcome. You can't do it any other way. That is not practice at what seems to be a lower level. Obviously, a rhinoceros does not construct ideas of future and all that. Since you have done it in your own state, the total realization that can come about in you is a very, very necessary element. There could be, for example, no ideas of what you would call quantum physics or relativity without fundamental notion of Newtonianism. You have to have a concept of the possibility of objectivity. That's a form of evolution, sure. And that all occurs within your own framework of thinking, if you care to look at it. There are certain ideas involved in the incredible notion of non-discretion. There's a paradox that is contained in specialness. For me to convey to you the idea that you are totally unique and special, but not in regards to anything separate from you. The idea that you are unique and special is contained in all of your fundamental existentialism. It is absolutely inevitable. The only single thing that you can know is that I am I. And we're back to that once again, accepting the notion that it is transcendental or theosophical or agnostic is a very major step. Jesus will teach in the Course in Miracles that all ideas of love are efforts to communicate. Finally, all communication is only self-identity or an attempt to identify self. Limitedness can never convey. Jesus would teach that it projects rather than extends. It projects from its concept of itself. And this is what fracturedism is. The idea that it is projected from the consciousness contains the whole, that is, it contains the idea of positive, negative, or the idea of comparison or conception. What we attempt to do in A Course in Miracles or in teaching a form of transformation is to cause you to think without discretion, really basically. That's what the atonement is. In the Course, it is taught as the limited state of consciousness in its attempt to perpetuate itself has established, in its own karma memory, patterns of resistance in order to sustain consciousness or defiance or self-regulation. Limitation inevitably results in grievance or the idea that there is a form outside of you that could cause fear or attack or concern to you as a consciousness. The whole basis of your karma, of your memory in the schismed universe of duality, is obviously based on self-subsistence in limitations. That isn't hard. Jesus in the Course says that all of your thinking is what? Post-schism. That is, you think in a manner that involves a continual breakdown in the limitation of your consciousness. Yes, it does, of course. But if you stop and look at it, there's contained in your fabric the idea of unity. Obviously, it is necessary that you participate in that equation. Did you look at the chaos out there as individual consciousnesses attempt to sustain their own identities? Wow, that's an amazing thing. No wonder it's chaotic. All of them are indeed unique in their historic patterns. There is not one single fingerprint that isn't the same as any other fingerprint. That's a nice way to look at it if you want to. And there's billions of them. And they keep breaking down and breaking down. Survival of the fittest, in reality, is simply survival of the limited state at that moment of its own individual consciousness. Limitation always divides. Wow, there are 846 species of beetles within 1 square mile in the Brazilian jungle. Holy mackerel. Brother Andrew, are you saying we break down everything? Yes. What you have done in your basic concept right here is broken yourself down from this table. You obviously consider this table to be separate from you, don't you? Why? What is that table? You're going to answer me by looking into your mind in a previous construct and informing me what that table is. If I keep asking you questions, you're screwed. There's no way you can tell me what that table is. You have absolutely no idea what it is in reality. Try it if you want. These are just exercises. This is in the workbook of A Course in Miracles. It is exactly what occurs. We can sit here forever. You will never be able to find it. You will break it down, and you keep breaking it down, and you keep breaking it down. And you arrive at the molecules, and then you will get into other divisions of it in your mind. Don't you see? Ultimately, what you do is give up and allow it to be a table and utilize it in your own limited consciousness. This is what the fabric of society really is. The use of objectivity in limitation is all that we really do here. Then we'll battle each other over our ideas of what this table is. I'm very capable of killing you over my insistence that this is a particular table, or over the possession of the table, since it's outside of me and I want to hold on to it. The idea of scarcity is involved with that. Brother Andrew, I can see it, but I can tell you what I'm seeing. But I'm experiencing that something is there. Does that mean I'm still off the mark? You are off the mark automatically, but that's okay. Really, what you have begun to do then is what? Examine your own projections or your own thoughts, which is a very necessary part of the awakening process. That's why I would teach you to look at the table and say, what is it? When you come into a framework of unifying in thinking, You may very well look at that table and see it as the Last Supper table, for example. You will see it as anything that you have constructed in your mind. The whole basic tenet of what we think, and you must get this, is conception always precedes perception. It is absolutely inevitable. Will you grant me that? Brother Andrew, that means that I think of the table before I see it. You must. You're sitting right on what I just talked about, Brother Andrew. So I have the fear before the action. You have the need to protect your own identity in your own framework of consciousness, of course. You are only what you are. As you come out with that, as you begin to think, you construct all this variety and sustain your limited consciousness through variety rather than unity. It will never work. The dilemma of Adam having to name the animals is incredible. He ends up with a continual breakdown of the species. Why? Because he's got himself separate from it. And he'll be keep breaking it down and breaking it down. It's inevitable. The way you finally teach it, however, would be simply the acceptance of your own thoughts. This is what we would teach in A Course in Miracles. If there is only your thought about something, in other words, if you are the conceptor of the universe, you are a creator. I assure you this is true. Since you are in duality and self-protection, you have established and delineated in your own consciousness relative states and ideas about what constitutes your makeup. We would teach it in A Course in Miracles that it is impossible for you to have a thought that will ever leave you. Here's the whole dilemma of guilt. If you are attempting to establish yourself in limitation, and obviously you succeed in doing it, you have by nature the necessity to order your thoughts. You cannot not do it. You automatically reject and sustain some thoughts apparently in your consciousness. This is in the New Testament. This is what Jesus tries to teach. In a very real sense, I'm sorry, if you think of murderer, you are the murderer. It's absolutely inevitable. You don't want to look at that. I know that you don't want to look at that. You do not want to be responsible for your own thinking, but you are. You will do everything but be responsible for it. Why? Because you've constructed death. And you don't want to be responsible for death, do you see? Can you see that one death is all deaths? If one thing dies, everything dies. Look at it. Death is limitation. That's what we live in here. Death defines life. That means that you're basing your consciousness on the concept that there's an annihilation or a termination. Any way you look on Earth, you have constructed a form of cyclicalness or something that evolves. Really, it's an establishment of time and space, and that ultimately leads to an apparent termination. There are expressions that are not acceptable in A Course in Miracles, like anything that is not forever is not real. Tell me something that is forever. You can't. Then you will attempt a concept of God. You will say to me, God is eternal. But there can be no eternity outside your idea about it. What am I saying to you? God is your idea. Death is your idea. Look at it. Tell me about God. Tell me about truth. Tell me what truth is. You can't. You can only be it. The notion that you can have ideas is a very strange thing. Who are you then? What do you have? You have ideas about things. You're simply separated. Can't you see that you are the idea? Brother Andrew, am I everything in that I experience? Yes, only. Amen. You don't like that though. You can't tell the difference between pleasure and pain, but you keep trying. There's a concept in the human mind of continuity. that we just spoke of as a high necessity to coming about of the realization of singularity, it occurs dramatically in the notion of reincarnation. The idea of a continuing consciousness has great validity. The problem with reincarnation is the sense of limitation involved in the obvious notions of separateness in the memory pattern. That is to say, you were nothing specific in the past, but everything in your own relationship of consciousness. I used to try to express that with the definition of the passion of the crucifixion, where you were no more Peter than you were the Roman soldier. Everything is your idea about it. Now, if you have a mystical experience in reincarnation where you speak fluent Sanskrit, of course, I have already allowed you that the configuration of your consciousness genetically not only contains all possibilities, but contains all previous occurrences in the whole schism. It is only your dream, brother. History is not objective. History is not an occurrence of separate specific things. That is just in your mind that it is. What is history? What is history, finally, except what you think it is, or what you arrive at in aggregate with your people at the particular time? We can arrive at the conclusion that Hitler was an evil man, and you'll get some people after 50 years to say he wasn't so bad. Isn't that funny? Everybody just keeps rewriting history. Don't you see that? History is always based on experience of consciousness. For goodness sake, we'll rewrite it anytime you want to. What's nice to see occur in the consciousness is taking of the allegory of duality, which is really nothing but what the process of awakening is, and having it reconstructed in your mind to a single truth. What is it you are trying to prove when you ask these questions, but yourself in limitation? I'll accept anything that you say to me. It's time that your mind began to look at the occurrences of the fairy tale as having the reality of revelation contained within it. What's more mystical than the Battle of Waterloo? It's what you make it in your mind. Freedom, quite literally. What we ask you to do, say in the workbook of A Course in Miracles, is to free yourself from your own limited configurations. As that begins to occur in you, it's an extremely joyous and happy and incredible occurrence because it is freedom. It begins basically with the fundamental idea that somewhere within the framework in which you are conceiving of yourself, there's contained a unity or a truth or a singularity. This is the tacit knowledge of duality. It is inevitable that the earth would not be here had it not somewhere within a framework, however limited, constructed the conception of a God or truth or wholeness. The next step that you will attempt to teach is that, since it cannot be found here, to gain the knowledge must be a form of transformation or a changing of mind, or an enlightenment, or an aha experience, or a resurrection, or a genius definition, or a symphony, or a beautiful poem, or anything that brings about a shift in your basic awareness of your relationship with what apparently is outside of you. This is the basis of everything that I teach. We have reached very nicely in this configuration sociologically the acknowledgement that gaining truth could be in fact transformative. It has always been known among esoteric circles. The whole idea of the ancient wisdom, the whole basic fundamental concept of religion, Christianity, is based on the knowledge of God being gained by a transformative occurrence or a resurrection. That is in all literature. It insinuates every possibility of conception of man in duality. So if we are going to teach it, the ability that is inherent in the individual consciousness to conceive of itself as whole must be at least an intellectual presumption. If you come into a group, you must somehow assume and do at some level, that you are there for what you might call a legitimate purpose, to come to know who you are. As indicated, if you will look at this basket, this is really what's occurring in your minds now, and instead of saying, you are a basket, you say, what are you? Don't tell it what it is, ask it what it is. Do you see how simple that is? Obviously, if you tell it what it is, it simply becomes a configuration in your own state of memory or your limited consciousness. There's a very beautiful passage in one of the first 20 lessons in the Course in Miracles that reads something like this. I can get you to grant that the past is not now, so it's impossible for you to think about it in reality, and that the future is not now, and it's really impossible for you to construct it. So quite literally, moment by moment, on the planet Earth, everybody's minds are literally blank. They are not thinking of anything. Do you see? All they do is construct the past as they have observed it, which is not now, and project it out into the future. It's a beautiful way to look at it. So we have people walking around and nobody, quite literally, is thinking at all. The upshot of that, or the actual reality of that, is that it's absolutely impossible for there to be any form of communication in the chaos. Why? Because everybody is simply basing what they see on their own individual concepts, on the past. It has no reality. Uh-oh. Now we're into it, into what we really have to say about this. Quite obviously, if we have granted that there is a single source, you and I individually and in concert with all other consciousnesses must ultimately share that reality. And that's what we're attempting to bring about in the Brotherhood. That's all. The Course in Miracles calls it love. It has obviously nothing to do with love or attempts at communication that are fostered here in duality, in the chaos. It couldn't. Why? Because love does not involve perception. Perception is always distinguishing. This would be taught in the Course in Miracles as, it is impossible for you to have a neutral thought. Try to. You can't. Do you see? It's impossible not to take sides in perception, because perception or conception of a limited self is based on taking sides. And subsequently, you have the incredible dilemma of literally rejecting or attempting to reject some of your own discernment. High thought coming. An idea can never leave its source. Its reality is only contained in the whole, which is another way of saying that two things cannot know each other because two-ness is constructed on duality. So you have the apparent species, Homo sapiens, sitting in a state of duality in a virtual attempt to sort out his own fracturedism or his own consciousness and choose in preference things to sustain his limited consciousness. Jesus in the Course tries to express it this way. Everything around you is an effect of your thought and has no reality because your thought of it has no reality. One of the nice ways to come to know that is to at least acknowledge that there is nothing outside of you. It can only be your thoughts that are affecting you. That's a nice way to look at it. Obviously, that is true. Only your idea about something or how you have constructed it within your own memory or karma frame network gives it apparent validity at all. Since the whole notion of limited consciousness is based on, again, A Course in Miracles calls it attack or defense. You might look at it in this way. A state of consciousness where there is apparently outside of you something that could affect you without your acquiescence to it is what causes all pain and grievance and murder and all the things and the other things that go with it. Obviously, this is so. We can teach you, and you have come to learn that you are being affected by your own ideas about things. That's very nice. Finally, the universe is only an idea. If the idea is limited, obviously it is not universal, so that the thinker cannot stand separate from the thought. As long as you believe in your separate state of consciousness, through constructed limitation, that the thinker can be separate from his thought, you will remain space-time. You cannot not do it. The whole basis of the idea that you can stand outside of your own thought is what has created space. If I stand here in front of you in a limited state and say, I am Theodore, everybody, that is a pole over there. I have obviously constructed what? A space between myself and the pole, and the time that would be involved for me to move from this space to that space. If my idea about that pole is finally only a configuration in my own consciousness, it in fact has never left my thought about it. This is high truth. This can be practiced. This is what A Course in Miracles attempts to bring about in the workbook in the first 50 lessons. In order to come to that, I may look at the pole and say to the pole not, you're a pole, but at the first lesson of A Course teaches, I don't know what you are. What? Look at what happened. I don't know what anything is. Wow, look at what happened. What's the next step? You look at the pole and say to the pole, what are you? What does this do then within your own framework of consciousness? This can really be practiced. It makes you, for that moment, come into the idea that you are extending a thought at that moment, not based on your previous recognition of it. What did you begin to do? You began to think. Thinking on earth has absolutely nothing to do with really thinking. This is all in A Course in Miracles in the first 50 lessons. That is a little disconcerting. And people who insist on grounding themselves to limited consciousness will look at me and say, well, that might be very true, but when my mind begins to do that, I become frightened because I'm losing my identity. If this is not a lamp, I've got a very serious problem, do you see? Yet instead of, I stand in front of you and say, this is not a lamp. And if I ask you to define it for me, you will look at it and proceed to break it up into parts in order to what? Authenticate yourself in pieces. It's amazing how your mind works. Now this group is obviously coming into a high state of what you might call aggregate consciousness. What would brotherhood or communion be but the acknowledgement first of a singleness of truth? That is to say, altruistically, truth is true and nothing else is true, which belies the possibility of relativity or actual separate relationships within a true framework of consciousness. That then can cause us to what? Flow within our own memory patterns. Remember that since limited consciousness is based in space-time on historic schism, it is necessary that you come to know that all of your thoughts in duality are in fact based on limitedness. Religiously, that is called evilness or the fall. What we're really doing with your mind is bringing you, because you contain what you might term the genetic capability to conceive of truth of God. Obviously, you can do it since you have done it, to the realization that since everything is finally only your thought about it, you must literally be the truth of God. You cannot not be. It's another way of saying you can't separate from your own ideas. This is the whole basis of the attempt in space-time at Christhood or guruship, or the establishment of an apparent entity who has gone through a transformative occurrence and can convey, through energy or ideas, or by whatever means, a form whereby you, individually, in your consciousness, can come to know the truth. Taught at its highest level in consummation, there must be an acknowledgement on the individual consciousness, part of it, that it is, in fact, truth unto itself. That has always been taught. A Course in Miracles says empathetically that this is a course in knowing yourself. It couldn't possibly be anything but that. And everybody nods their head. Know thyself is one of the fundamentals, but it's much deeper than that. You must know yourself because there's literally nothing else that you could know. Wow. The presentation in the workbook of A Course in Miracles, with the immediate inevitability of that realization, places everyone in a high state of denial before they even begin. You can't even open it up and you have a problem if you start out with some basic things. They're very nice to look at. Lesson 8. The past is not here. When you think about the past or anticipate the future, your mind is actually blank. That's what I just said. Lesson 14. Let me see somebody gobble this one up. Are you ready? The world you see has nothing to do with reality. It is of your own making and it does not exist. That's a nice place to start. It starts out very nicely. Everything you see is the result of your thoughts. No exceptions. No idle thoughts. A neutral thought is impossible. Listen. Number 19. Cause and effect are never separated. Thinking and its results are simultaneous. Holy mackerel. It is a fact that there are no private thoughts. Oh, come now. Somewhere along the line, I'm entitled to a little privacy. Listen to me. You are entitled to total privacy, and that is in fact all that God has. Total privacy. Can't you see that? You are all able to look very much at that. Since there is nothing outside of you, you are, of course, totally private. What is more personal than God? What have you done with your own ideas to cause something to be outside of you that you could subsequently harm you or cause you concern or bring about friction in you? There's no reality in combat or friction. There couldn't be. It is not possible. Wow, you ought to begin to teach this. When you see separate things, you're not really seeing at all. That's lovely. I'm throwing in lesson 23 because nobody wants to really look at it. The only way out of fear is to give up attack and defense. Resist not evil. Do not participate in chaos of your own limited projections. Wow. I wrote some strange things down this morning. I did some song titles. This is a digression. There is no assurance without occurrence. That's a dandy. That is, if you don't undergo a process, you can never be sure of anything. That's the way you can always tell an awakened consciousness or one that's awake. You may not be able to know that he's sure about, but you can see that he is sure about whatever it is that you're not sure that he is sure about. Well, that's a lovely definition. This is one for Nikki. Try not to smile on your own denial. That's a dandy. Somehow we admit that we're denying and kind of take satisfaction in your own denial. Really, that doesn't bring about anything. This one was designed for Nikki too. It's a definition of Tantric Yoga. Finding lasting peace through a lasting peace. Put that as a bumper sticker for Tantric Yoga people. Bless their hearts. The acknowledgement that this transformation is going on in you can bring about an incredible serenity and peace because as you refine your own fractured past through recollection of your own perfection, You allow everything that apparently is occurring outside of you to be as it is, without attempting to ascertain its historic frame of reference, through detachment. Isn't it lovely to be able to do that? Each time that you do that, when you do not apply in consciousness specific cause and effect relationships, there occurs in your own energy relationship a pitching up or a raising of the energy. This is really what we're attempt to teach is happening to you. Your mind will then begin to reconfigure incredible occurrences that have happened in your past associations. You will begin to see them in a new focus or a new frame of reference where they come together finally in an incredible single acknowledgement that the whole purpose of your state of consciousness was the metamorphosis that is now occurring in you. Is that beautiful? You may then want to study it in books. Like you may want to quickly get a comparison between the I Ching and the genetic code. You may find it a thrill in seeing that the helix in the genetic code is the same as the symbol of the I Ching or the total potential of the universe. You go, oh my. And then, as the shift occurs to you, in you, you look about and you'll see in your mind incredible connections of color, sound, and thought. Art and poetry and literature will all come together in a singleness of the very, very obvious, incredible consciousness allegory of space-time. It's lovely. You'll take all of the fairy tales and translate them, not through a process of intellectualizing them, but rather in a form of iconism or symbolism, into a reality that they are to demonstrate to you the occurrence of your own transformation. You will find in this process that your mind begins then to what? Do it with everything. So when we look at the basket, instead of saying you are a basket, or the next step, what are you? You look at the basket and say, I know in truth that you represent me in truth, and by my realization of your wholeness, I see myself as whole. What do we finally teach you then to do? Reject everything you apparently think is real, in order to see that finally only you are reality. This is what we're trying to do now in this process. As this occurrence reaches maturity in you, you may very well experience what apparently is conflict. Remember, in your attempt to stand aside from your own limited ideas, you will be in denial and finally defiance of the constructs of the earth. From a religious standpoint, each consciousness unto itself practices on an apparent moment-by-moment basis of the denial of its own true self, and establishes in limitation outside of itself constructs in order to sustain, through memory, its own limitation. The real problem that you have individually in consciousness is that you have conceived of truth and harmony and love in God, and are not yet in a state to recognize that this is, in fact, you. Perhaps the way now for you to look at it is this. Everything is perfect unto itself, because everything is only itself. There can be no consciousness outside of the total identity of a state of awareness or a beingness. The zebra does not suffer pain in regard to its own identity. It is constructed within its limited framework of memory to the configuration of its establishment in duality. Finally, since you have 1% within your genetic code that is at variance with the chimpanzee, you are not a chimpanzee. The chimpanzee knows perfectly well what it is. It does not construct death in its mind. It does not bury its death with artifacts to sustain in it its journey in consciousness. The thought has not occurred to it, but it has occurred to you. And this engenders great fear in you, doesn't it? Because apparently obliviation is God. Actually, what you do is construct a method of coming to God or truth through death. Wow, that's a strange thing to do. As a Christ, as an awakened consciousness, you will come into this chaos and present the limited state with the inevitable recognition that there is no death, there's no termination, there's no oblivion, an obliviation, and that consciousness individually, in its own concert of apparent reality, will always be in a state in which it finds itself at this moment. In actuality, most consciousnesses are not afraid of death, for they have constructed it as an escape from life, which they are indeed deadly afraid of. We have come to discover that eternity is not a long time, but only this moment when we share our truth in love and in joy and happiness. Well, we'll have just some little quiet time. Then it's sleepy time outside. Be very gentle now. Wow, he really had quiet times that were quiet. That's very lovely.